Hello, Professor Postma, and hello, Psych 100 class, for those of you that are watching. Um, my name is Sebastian, and this is my P2 review. And the three articles I've chosen all center around the topic of racial diversity, and in particular, the impact of racial diversity on racial discrimination. And it should probably come as no surprise that the current racial climate in the United States has definitely played a role in choosing these articles. And before jumping into it, let me get myself out of the way of the slides here. All right, so here are the three articles I'll be reviewing. I'll reference the ones I'm talking about on each slide somewhere on the slide itself, usually at the top or the bottom, and I'll make sure to bring up this slide at the end. So, summarizing the articles, as I mentioned, the common theme across all three is the impact of racial diversity on racial discrimination. Or does increasing racial diversity decrease or maybe even increase discrimination? And some quick notes about terminology in the articles. First, they use the terms racial diversity, multiculturalism, and intergroup contact to basically mean the same thing, and that being contact between different racial groups, and more accurately, between majority and other minority groups. And I'll be using those three terms interchangeably here. Also, in all the articles, when we're talking about the majority, it's always associated with the white or Caucasian population, and I'll be using those interchangeably as well. So the first article primarily focuses on research, which suggests that the more that white groups have positive interactions with other races and ethnicities, the lower the racial discrimination between the whites in those groups. That being said, the second and third articles point to many different pitfalls of multiculturalism, as well as external factors where exposure could actually lead to an increase in discrimination. And I'll get back to that in a little bit. But first, back to the first article, and it begins by laying out what racial inequality currently looks like in the United States. It points to data from 2016, which shows a significant difference in incarceration rates between white Americans and Black Americans. And it points to data that shows the significantly lower likelihood that Black Americans are hired for jobs compared to white Americans with equal qualifications. At the same time, the article points out that even with this statistical data, these inequalities are not easily accepted, showing that only about a third of white Americans believe that racial discrimination is a major factor in limiting Black Americans. And from this, the authors move into trying to answer the question of what is it in this 1/3 of the population that makes it willing to acknowledge racial discrimination? And then from there, the article goes into showing how intergroup contact plays the largest role. So the authors look at how the consequences of positive racial diversity can be broken down into two categories. First, in most cases, not all, there's a decreased sense of threat that the majority feels from changing demographics. And second, there's an increased sense of investment that the majority group has in the well-being of other groups. Now, what the authors say about the decreased sense of threat by whites is that the end result is ultimately limited to what is referred to as passive interracial acceptance, or it's limited to reducing prejudice and increasing tolerance. Now, the authors say it's limited because those results end up being much less significant compared to the second category of results. And this second category is what the article refers to as an increase in the psychological investment in the well-being of the marginalized. And what do they mean by this? Well, there are three parts that they suggest make up psychological investment. First, they mean that there's a development of empathy towards the marginalized from the majority. They refer to two separate studies on college campuses where white students who were in some way induced to take the perspective of Black students, and I'm not exactly sure how that was done, but those white students reported taking more action in response to hate crimes targeting Blacks. Second, the authors also mean that there's an increase in the humanization of the marginalized by the majority. There are several studies referenced in the article which suggest that members of advantaged racial groups tend to dehumanize members of disadvantaged racial groups, and this effect is reversed by cooperative and friendly contact between the groups. And lastly, the authors suggest that personal relevance increases with multicultural contact. They show that by default, an advantaged racial group sees the acknowledgement of racial injustice and inequality as running counter to their group interest. However, by having meaningful contact across groups, the members of the advantaged racial group start to see the interests and challenges of the other groups as being relevant to their own. So going back and comparing this to the decrease in feeling threatened, Trop and Barlow show that rather than seeing an increase in passive acceptance, these three factors, result in an increase in active interracial acceptance. And this includes greater willingness to take action to challenge racial inequality. And I'll quickly mention that all three of these articles agree that as long as the multicultural context is considered positive, the result is always a decrease in racial discrimination. There'll be more on that later. Moving on to the second paper titled, Do Colorblindness and Multiculturalism Remedy or Foster Discrimination and Racism? The authors jump straight into looking at racial diversity from two different perspectives. First, they compare it to the concept of colorblindness to see which results in a higher impact on racial discrimination. And second, they look at whether there are any ways that racial diversity could increase racial discrimination. They actually do this for both multiculturalism and colorblindness. But let's first look at the comparison with colorblindness to multiculturalism, and I'll just start by defining the term colorblindness. And the article refers to it as identity blindness, or the idea that race should not and does not matter. The article also refers to two different studies, one in 2008 and one in 2009, which suggests that whites tend to prefer colorblindness more than multiculturalism. The main reasons, according to the research, is that it allows whites to maintain an image of a fair society, even when it may not be. And it also allows the privileged group to maintain the status quo, which is much easier to do, than to make structural changes to the society. As far as how the impact of colorblindness differs from multiculturalism, well, spoiler alert, the article refers to many different studies that show that the former generally has a negative impact on racial discrimination, whereas multiculturalism tends to have a more positive impact, decreasing racial discrimination. More specifically, the article points to research which shows that colorblindness tends to lead to a decrease in plausibility of racism, decreasing the opportunity to address it. And it also leads to a decrease of sensitivity towards racist microaggressions. Two studies in particular that were cited were both done in schools, one in 1989 with teachers and one in 2014 with students, where both studies found that teachers and students practicing colorblindness became desensitized to the point that they would recall the details of racist events much differently than the control groups. And they were also much less likely to report racial discrimination to their superiors. So both the first and the second articles point to multiculturalism. You'd think I could say this by now. They point to it as the preferred approach to addressing racial discrimination. That said, the second article also points out a few pitfalls with the idea. And we'll go into that next. And then later we'll see how the third article points out a couple of factors, external factors that also result in diversity negatively impacting discrimination, meaning it increases it. It's negatively impacting, but it increases it. Okay, so what is it that Plout and his co-authors say about the negative impact of racial diversity? And again, negative impact here meaning it increases discrimination. We just consider that a negative. It's the best way to think about it. So first, they point to studies which show that increasing the interactions between white Americans and Black Americans could actually increase stereotyping by whites in certain situations. They show data which indicates that white Americans in these studies tend to have a higher likability score for Black Americans who practice stereotype consistent extracurricular activities versus those that practice stereotype inconsistent activities. Second, they show that the cognitive performance of Black Americans tends to drop in environments that promote diversity, but where the representation of their racial group is actually low. So they looked at a study in corporate environments where one set of companies averaged around 5% representation of Black Americans, and another set of companies which averaged around 40% representation. In the 5% case, the study found a decrease in the performance of minorities after receiving messages from their leadership promoting diversity, whereas the company with 40% representation saw an increase. The authors implied that there could be a sense of getting mixed messages in a less represented environment. Lastly, the authors mentioned that multiculturalism can backfire in cases where whites already feel under threat. It's mentioned very briefly, but they point to a 2011 study which showed that whites who are already feeling threatened by some unrelated issues, and one example they used was a partner threatening to leave them. In those cases, they tended to display more hostility in racially diverse situations than those that were not initially feeling threatened. So looking at this perceived sense of threat, we move to the third article. It's kind of a leap, but the pitfalls and it's titled "The Pitfalls and Promise of Increasing Racial Diversity: Threat, Contact, and Race Relations in the 21st Century." And much of the focus here turns towards how multiculturalism can increase the sense of threat that white Americans feel from growing minority groups. And the article begins by pointing out that at the current growth rates, white Americans will compose less than 50% of the population by around 2044. And from that, the authors form the basis of the rest of the paper, which is that there needs to be a focus on trying to scientifically predict the potential consequences of this growth so that we can try to address those consequences. And the first thing that's brought up as a pitfall is that racial diversity will backfire if the contact is surface level or if the ethnic groups are not in close enough proximity to one another. So there's a study reference which shows that the amount of ethnic diversity at the metropolitan level was correlated with greater prejudice, whereas at the neighborhood level, it predicted lower prejudice. Second, the article shows that the rate at which the minority group grows, even if it's just perceived, the perceived rate, can increase the sense of threat by the majority. There's a study reference which shows that if the perceived rate of growth of the minority is slow, even if it's consistent, so continually growing, and in the end results in a larger minority population as compared to where it's like fast growth, but it like spikes and jumps it up and down. Even if the slower case ends up with a bigger minority population, the majority will not feel the same level of threat. It's the rate really which is correlated with that sense of threat. Lastly, a critical factor that the authors point to in multiculturalism, which determines whether there's a sense of threat generated, is the socioeconomic status of the majority. They point to two studies which show that poor economic conditions and lower levels of social identification by white Americans predicts an increase in threat reactions to increasing diversity. And one final thing to mention in this article, excuse me, is that it points out that in some cases, not all, but in some, these factors can result in an increased sense of threat from one minority group to another. In one case, the authors mentioned studies which focused on geographic areas with an especially fast-growing Hispanic population, and how in those areas the Black and Asian Americans expressed greater support for conservative social policies, especially those related to immigration. In another case, the authors point to a study which shows that the size of the Hispanic population can predict the negative attitude towards that population by Black Americans, but only if the Black Americans perceive themselves as having an economic disadvantage. So that is a summary of the three articles I reviewed. I did bring up many of the studies referenced in these articles in the summary rather than the critical evaluation, but that's only because it seemed to fit more naturally there. That being said, onto the critical evaluation. So starting with the claims across all three articles that they shared, they all claimed, though to different extents, that racial diversity, which includes positive contact, will predict a drop in racial discrimination, the key here being positive. We saw in the first article that it's almost entirely focused on this claim, and so the amount of supporting evidence is much higher here than in the other two articles. Now recall that the claim in this article is that the key to interracial acceptance is psychological investment of whites in the welfare of the minorities. Excuse me, and that positive multiculturalism results in an increase in psychological investment. And to support this claim, the authors broke down psychological investment into those three subcomponents, and then the research was focused on each of those. So to support the claim that increased positive interaction resulted in increased empathy, they referenced 6 different studies, including the 2 I mentioned earlier, done on college campuses. To support the claim that increased positive interaction resulted in increased humanization, they referenced 2 articles, though they also pointed out that this is the area that really needed more scientific study than any other. As far as how these interactions can increase how much white Americans feel that the issues facing minorities are relevant to them, they pointed to 4 different studies, including one in particular in 2005, where white female undergraduates were paired with partners that were either white or an ethnic minority. And the study had them engage in a series of friendship building activities over the course of a few weeks, after which they had the students provide feedback on budget proposals made by the colleges. They showed that the white undergrads paired with minorities recommended significantly smaller cuts to minority student organizations as compared to those who were paired with other white undergrads. So I feel that this article has very strong evidence to support their claim, The one criticism that I have, not related to the claim, is the clarity of the article. It felt very verbose, and I found that I had to read through several of the sections multiple times because they would be filled with very long and wordy thoughts that were not easy to keep track of end to end within my limited working memory, going back to the many, many chapters ago in our book. For example, the article is filled with sentences like these two. In these sentences, I found that as I got halfway through, I would have to go back to the beginning and reread them to remember what they were about or go back to long-term memory, which we know takes cognitive effort. So that's my primary criticism. The other thing that I will mention is that unlike the other two articles, this article did not focus at all on potential pitfalls. It was all in support of the claim that positive contact results in psychological investment. I wasn't too critical about this because the paper didn't say it was going to talk about pitfalls, but I do prefer arguments to try to consider all perspectives. This made the paper seem a little one-sided. As far as the other two articles go, I evaluated both of them very similarly. They included the claim that positive contact reduced racial discrimination, but they also made counterclaims with some nuances around the idea of intergroup contact and showed evidence to support those as well. So in the positive case, in the second article, the authors referred to a study in 2009, which showed that exposing white Canadians to multiculturalism resulted in more positive, other-directed comments towards Aboriginal Canadian conversation partners. They also referred to a study where multiculturalism related to an increase in teachers' willingness to adapt their programs to ethnic minority students and to adopt inclusive teaching practices. For the third article, I mentioned earlier that the results in looking at multiculturalism at close proximity level showed a decrease in racial discrimination. The article also points to some interesting research in Germany, which showed that the percentage of ethnic minorities in different home districts was negatively related to the expression of anti-minority bias. So both articles had a couple of studies to support the claim, though certainly much less evidence than the first article. That said, as I pointed out in the summary, both articles also pointed to many studies which showed cases where multiculturalism can backfire. For that reason, I felt as though these two made stronger cases. They seemed more careful and more willing to look at contrary evidence. And for such a volatile topic as this, I think that's really important. This issue requires a lot of care to make sure it's handled properly. And so that takes me into the response section. And according to the instructions, this is the place for me to offer my personal opinion. Do I agree or disagree with the claims? Why or why not? Can I apply what these articles said to something in my own life or experience? And Professor Postma wants to know what I think and feel about what I've learned. So first, do I agree or disagree and why? Well, it's hard for me to disagree with how much data is in all of these articles. They all seem to have a lot of supporting data. In fact, I found the data so interesting and so compelling that I've been sharing it through all of my different social circles and at work. So I certainly agree with all three articles. Now, as I mentioned, I find the second and third much more convincing because they are willing to look at the other side of the coin. But that doesn't take away from the fact that the first article was filled with a large number of convincing studies for their claim. Can I apply what these articles said to something in my own life or experience? Well, as an obvious member of the advantaged or majority, the first thing that I think about with this question is where have I had experience of feeling threatened by minorities, or where have I felt I've been discriminating against minorities, and maybe how has diversity impacted that? And I'll just start by saying that in a video that's being distributed to a bunch of people that I only know a little bit, it is uncomfortable to talk about where I might have been discriminating or prejudiced. I'll begin with when I went to the University of Washington for my undergrad 20 years ago. The school at the time, and I'm not sure about where it is today, but at the time was, I would say, I don't want to say predominantly, but there was a large Asian population. And I would say I'd been in close proximity with a dozen or so Asian Americans. I lived in a fraternity with many Asian Americans. And so I felt that I had a lot of positive contact and interaction. At the same time, in two different incidents, one in my freshman year and one in my junior year, I was assaulted by two different groups of Asian Americans. These were each groups made up of about a dozen people, and in both cases, I ended up in the hospital. Nothing severe. But for a time after those incidents, for a few years, I would find myself having a physiological reaction around groups of Asian people. Looking back, it did seem like a form of fear. Now, I would never notice this in one-on-one interactions, and perhaps it was, I don't know, a minor PTSD response, but that certainly comes to mind because my reaction was isolated completely on the ethnicity of the group that I would be near. I wouldn't notice it in other groups that were of other ethnicities predominantly. So I think about that. And the other thing I think about is my time working at Amazon. I'm a software engineer, and the engineering teams there are made up predominantly of Indian men. And I do recall struggling with some negative stereotypes that I held, and it was difficult just to even be aware of them. And I'm sure there was some part of me that didn't want to believe that I was prejudiced, which maybe played a role in blocking that awareness. Excuse me. And I don't have any studies to point to support this, but I do believe that over the 2.5 years that I spent there working closely with many Indian men, trying to work together to solve different challenges, that it played a role in helping me to develop the awareness of my prejudices, which I do believe is the reason why I don't hold them today. What do I feel about what I've learned? There are some depressing things that I took away from these articles. The fact that only a third of whites believe that racial discrimination is a problem is a bit deflating. Though I suppose any data is useful in helping to direct us toward the solution. Knowing that most whites don't believe that this is an issue might help focus on studying the best way to create awareness. Something that I have mixed feelings about is the fact that it really has to be positive contact between racial groups. I mean, it makes sense, right? Negative contact it's going to be a lot harder to create positive relationships, but it was encouraging to see the numerous studies which showed that it worked if there was positive contact, and there were some great stories in many of those studies. The concern for me stems from all the things we've learned in class, which speak to how hard it is for human beings to be positive and to have that positive interaction. The fundamental attribution error is the first thing that occurred to me, and that seems like a very big hurdle to try to get past to get to positivity. The other thing is the impact of socioeconomics. That has been, I feel like, near the root of many of our issues today in our culture. And it seems to really get in the way of allowing positive interaction. And so I'm concerned that until there's some significant progress made in addressing the economic differences in this country, that we may struggle in a lot of other areas. So those are my thoughts and feelings. And so I don't end this on too somber of a note. I will add one more slide here with one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite human beings that I think is relevant to this topic. And to me, this says, we'll get there, just might take some time. Okay, again, here are the articles, and thank you for watching my review.